Watch those potted plants, folks, for this is botanical horror. Vallisneria Madness by Ralph Milne Farley. Seated comfortably on the broad terrace of Professor Gordon's palatial mansion, Tom Spencer stared abstractedly at the red disk of the setting sun, reflected in the turgid waters of the pool in the garden beyond the edge of the terrace, as he listened to his host recount the fascinating story of the love life of the Vallisneria. The cameo face of the white-haired botany professor bore a whimsical expression as he declaimed, "Beneath the black surface of that muddy pool out there, the flowers of a score or so of this rare plant which I brought from tropical Asia pass their entire humdrum life, except for one brief night of moonlit love, not unlike our human existence." Tom Spencer shifted his keen grey eyes to stare at the matted, ribbon-like leaves floating on top of the water, which gave little indication of floral life below. The old professor continued, "As you know from my lectures at Columbia, the Vallisneria is a dioecious plant. On one night of each year, the night of the vernal full moon, the stem of each female flower begins to stretch until its ghostly green and white bloom rises to the surface. Each male flower, too, feels that same impelling urge, an instinct within it that reaches and towers, as James Russell Lowell says. Listen to how Maeterlinck, that great poet and scientist, describes their fatal wooing." He opened a book which lay on his lap, tilted it so that its pages were illumined by the fading sunlight, and read aloud, "The green-coated male flowers rise in turn, full of hope, toward the flowers which already sway above them in the moonlight, awaiting them and summoning them to the magic world which lies beyond their native obscurity. But when half their upward journey is done, they reach the limit that their two short stems can stretch, and are checked abruptly before they can win their way to their indifferent sweethearts, who pridefully refuse to bend to caress them. Filled with yearning, the little heart of each male flower swells and swells until it breaks. In a magnificent effort to achieve his bliss, he tears himself from his stem, and in one incomparable flight rises to perish in love on the surface of the pool. Dying, but free and radiant, he floats for one brief ecstatic moment beside his beloved, then shrivels and floats away, while his mate closes the petals in which he has imprisoned his last breath of life, and shrinks back into the depths, there to ripen the fruit of that fatal union." The sun set as Professor Gordon closed his copy of Maeterlinck. A twilight mist began to form above the surface of the garden pool. "How much more noble are the flowers than we," he mused. "As Shakespeare says, men have died from time to time, and worms have eaten them, but not for love." His athletic young guest narrowed his grey eyes and stared inwardly at the vision conjured up by the elder man's reading. "I wonder," he breathed. Professor Gordon broke the spell by saying in a matter-of-fact tone, "Well, my boy, you are to see tonight the mating of Vallisneria, a sight which my colleagues would give their eye-teeth to witness." "I feel flattered," Spencer began diffidently, shifting his broad shoulders in an embarrassed manner. But the fine-featured old man silenced him with a deprecatory, "Don't, then. You are more outstanding as a football player than as a student of botany. I invited you for other reasons than any outstanding ability you may have shown in your 4 years of studies under me." Spencer thought, most likely to rub in on his colleagues his non-invitation of them, by asking instead a mere athlete who is taking botany merely because it's a cinch course. Meanwhile, the professor was continuing, "I am sorry that I can't stay out here with you. The mists affect my throat, and I'm sorry my daughter Natalie isn't here either. She helps me take care of the plants, and you'd find her quite intelligent about them, but she had to go over to her aunt's. I shouldn't think she'd care to miss—" Oh, it's an old story with Natalie. She's seen the phenomenon before. And now I must caution you about one thing. Don't go any nearer the pool than the edge of the terrace. The flowers, when in bloom, exude a strong narcotic fragrance, which is rather dangerous. Anyhow, you can see quite clearly from here. He rose and held out one slender, blue-veined hand. "Good night, sir," said Spencer, taking the frail hand in his big, strong one. "And thank you for inviting me." Tom Spencer eased his athletic frame down into one of the terrace chairs and gazed abstractedly at the purpling pink of the western sky. "Just as well that that brat of his isn't here tonight," he mused. "What on earth could I do to amuse her?" He remembered having seen Natalie Gordon several times during his freshman year, hanging around the door of the Botany building at Morningside Heights, waiting for her father. A gawky, pug-nosed, freckle-faced little thing with two tightly braided pigtails, about 14 or 15 years old, so he judged. Just as well the brat wasn't here. Spencer turned his attention back to the garden pool, but pitch darkness had now fallen, and he could see nothing except the outline of the shrubs against the deep purple of the western sky. Then trees in the distance became dimly lit by the full moon, which was rising behind the house, but the long shadow of the house still obscured the garden and its pool. A vagrant zephyr wafted a damp, muddy scent of mist up from the hidden pool. "I wonder if those water plants have any consciousness, any volition about their tragic mating," mused Spencer. "Or is it all merely automatic, mechanistic?" He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and visualized the passage from Martelink, which the old botany professor had read to him. He opened his eyes again with a start and sat erect. The shadow of the house had receded to the edge of the terrace, and the entire garden, with a pool in its midst, was now bathed in the chalky light of the moon, almost overhead. Above the surface of the water hung a cottony swirling mist, which seemed to portend some sort of boiling activity in the depths of the muddy pool. The mist thickened and spilled out onto the surrounding garden. "Humph!" sniffed Spencer, getting up out of his chair. "Can't see a thing from here." And, forgetful of Professor Gordon's express injunction, he ambled down off the terrace and along the garden walk to the edge of the pool. Through gaps in the swirling mist, he could see the matted ribbon-like vegetation floating inertly in the water. Not a sign of a flower. So he swung back to the terrace and slumped down again in his chair. The mist continued to thicken. "I guess there'll be no show tonight," Spencer grumbled disgustedly. Then suddenly he sat erect, thrust his broad shoulders forward, and peered intently through the gathering fog, where dark shapes, human-like shapes, seemed to be moving, brushing the mist away, shedding it, rising above it, and yet still seeming to be a part of it. They stood out at last, clear in the moonlight, majestic women, Valkyries, with proudly held blonde heads and flashing eyes. Filmy, floating, lunar-green robes set off the chalky whiteness of their perfect features. A heady perfume wafted across from the hidden pool. The mist receded until it concealed merely the feet of the beautiful creatures. Where they stood, whether on the surface of the pool or on its banks, Spencer could not tell. Swaying slightly, as though rooted, they undulated their green-swathed arms like seaweed in the tide. Their heads thrown back with an almost defiant gesture, they bathed their perfect features in the glaring white light of the zenith moon. Never had Tom Spencer seen such sheer feminine beauty. He had no recollection of leaving his seat, but now he found himself standing at the edge of the terrace, irresistibly drawn by a strange yearning toward that galaxy of pulchritude. There were some 20 or so of the young women, their faces all different, each a face of character and personality, each more beautiful than the last. Irresolute, Spencer held out his arms toward the entire group. Which one drew him? To which one should he drift? the uncertainty held him back. That, and the subconscious memory of some warning, some prohibition, and some third, as yet undefined prompting. And, while he hesitated, there appeared, poking up through the mist at the feet of the strange regal women, the points of a score of green-peaked hats. Up they came, and faces appeared beneath them, dark, cleanly cut, handsome faces of men, tense, yearning faces, with flashing, fanatic eyes, each pair of eyes fixed on one of the beautiful women who towered above. Gradually they rose, until each man, clad in dark Lincoln green, stood beside one of the pale, diaphanous women. And then a strange, inexplicable paradox. The beautiful women were slender, completely feminine, utterly adorable. The men were well-built, athletic, thoroughly masculine, seemingly tall rather than short, and yet the women towered above them. Tom Spencer's mind flashed incongruously back to the scrapbooks of his childhood days, in which he had frequently pasted figures from pictures taken in different scales, with the result that each figure, properly proportioned by itself, failed to match the others in size. Each of the men now clasped his arms around the waist of his beloved, and stretched, every sinew of his athletic body taut with the effort. Although Spencer could not see their feet for the mist which covered them, he knew that they were standing on tiptoe. An inarticulate sigh went up from all of them. Kiss me, it pleaded. Kiss me, though I die. But the stately women stiffened, and held themselves more aloof, and towered even more inaccessibly, with a beauty so flaming that it hurt. Then their sea-swaying arms floated down until their slim white hands rested on the shoulders of the men. The pearly faces of the women inclined slightly, not enough to meet the upward-straining lips of their mates, but just enough so that they could gaze coldly but enticingly down. A silvery ripple of sound floated through the moonlight. The women were speaking, but what they were saying Spencer could not tell. A strangled flush spread over the faces of the men, as, lifted by the hands of the women, they rose slowly, until, white now with a livid whiteness, their lips met in one passionate, soul-searing embrace. Tom Spencer drew in a deep breath, and his fingers clenched, then sprang open with a sudden gesture of horror, as he realized that those male heads, so tightly clinging lip to lip with the beautiful mist women, were bodiless. The green-clad bodies, which had strained so tautly to thrust their heads up to that kiss of death, were now slowly slumping, settling downward, shriveling, turning brown, drifting away in the swirling mists which bathed the feet of the majestic women. The heads themselves had lost their realness. The skin had become wrinkled, leathery, deflated, flabby. The features were scarcely distinguishable. Then, one by one, with a contemptuous gesture of satiation, the women flung away the sucked dry rinds, and Tom Spencer, his gaze intent upon the expressions on the women's faces, took no heed what became of the cast-off rinds. For a subtle change was taking place in those beautiful but cruel creatures. A certain matronly smugness coarsened their features, and they seemed less tall. Yes, they were visibly shrinking and becoming squat and ugly, shrinking back into the mists which masked the muddy pool. All returning to the slime which had spawned them. All but one. Alone she stood, unmated, still towering slim and beautiful in the moonlight. And then Tom Spencer knew why he had waited, why he had not gone to any of the others. For, transcendently beautiful though they had all been, yet this sole survivor of that glorious company outshone them all. Erect she stood, her golden head thrown back, her arms stretched to each side and raised a little, so that the filmy pale green gauze of her gown hung from them like the wings of a lunar moth. Spencer gasped and rose from his chair. Forgotten were the warnings of Professor Gordon, as the young man moved steadily out off the terrace, into the misty moonlight. Her lips parted, a smile of welcome overspread her cameo face, and then she spoke, a tinkly, silver, moonlit, rippling voice. "Have you been waiting long for me?" "All my life," breathed Spencer. She laughed, a friendly, silvery laugh. Like a sleepwalker, Spencer continued to plod toward her. 6'1" he was, a gridiron star, and yet this frail, slim wisp of a feminine creature towered inaccessibly above him in the mists of the pool. Spencer reached her. He clasped his arms around her waist and stretched, every sinew of his athletic body taut with effort. He raised his heels from the ground and strained on tiptoe. A sigh breathed upward from his lips. Kiss me, he pleaded. "Kiss me, though I die." But she stiffened and held herself more aloof and towered even more inaccessibly, while her beauty flamed out so intensely that it gripped Spencer's heart with a stabbing pain. Then her widespread arms floated down until her slim, cool, white hands rested on Spencer's shoulders. Her cameo-cut face inclined slightly, not enough to meet the upward straining lips of the young man, but merely enough so that she could gaze coldly but enticingly down into his eyes. Like a drowning man, there swept through his mind the visions of heads wrenched from male shoulders, sucked dry and cast aside, male bodies shriveling and drifting away. Well, it was worth it for that one moment of transcendent ecstasy. But at the memory picture of the transformation wrought in the beautiful mist woman by that long, passionate embrace, he shuddered momentarily. However, he would be gone then. He would not be there to see it. Once more he strained to reach his beloved. But the expected strangling wrench on his neck did not come. Instead, the stiff aloofness of the beautiful girl softened. An expression of yielding consecration suffused her lovely face. She leaned, she bent over him, and floated down into his arms. Their lips met and clung. A breeze whipped her moon-green gown about him. Opening his eyes, he saw the mists blown away from the stone bench on which he had been standing by the edge of the garden pool. Now, nestled in his arms, she no longer seemed terrifyingly dominating and aloof, but instead small and sweet and soft, and she did not coarsen and sink back into the slime of the pool. Side by side, they sat down together on the stone bench, his arm about her slender waist, her golden head against his shoulder. For a long time they sat thus in silence. Then, "Tom," she breathed. "You know my name?" he asked in surprise. "Why not?" She laughed a silvery moonlit laugh. Again they sat in silence. At last she pushed softly away from him. "Well, dear," she said, "it is very late, and we really ought to be going in." Into the pool?" "No, silly, into the house." He turned and seized her by the shoulders and stared fixedly down at her in the moonlight. Then, with a sigh of gladness, he clasped her to him. "You're Natalie Gordon," he breathed. "You're real, and I like you much better that way." "I don't know what on earth you're talking about," said she, "but it's all right with me." She held up her face, and once more his lips closed on hers, this time in a wholly human embrace. When the Flame Flowers Blossomed, by Leslie F. Stone. One moment the forest was serenely quiet, somnolent. The next it was in an uproar. For it was not every day that a spaceship dropped out of the swirling mists that topped the waving fern crown of the tallest and most ancient of the great Ancardus tree ferns, furrowing the rich dark loam of the clearing floor. Not that the Ancardus guessed the long black cylinder to be a spaceship. Their conception of the universe was limited to that space beneath the grey cloud masses that enfolded their world, nor could they conceive of a vehicle of transportation. For their life began in an overlarge, hard-cased seed spore that grew into a free-moving young tree fern that made the best of its God-given activity until the urge to root itself came. Then one stood ever upright, living and dreaming, conversing with one's neighbors, ever ready to flip forth a tentacle to ensnare one of the silly, unthinkable animals that foolishly accepted the lure of the fleshy, false fruits that the Ancardus dangled as bait for just that purpose. Nevertheless, they were stirred, curious. From amid the stationary boughs of their elders came the young ferns, balancing themselves upon their 5 walking roots, eager to see what they could see, just as young earthlings would have pushed themselves forward between the bodies of their elders had such a strange phenomenon taken place on their main street. Unmolested by the cutting axe of man, with no other enemy than the encroaching, life-choking parasitic vines that the Ancardus, by means of their long flexible tentacles, kept to the background, the great tree ferns were truly the monarchs of all they surveyed. Since Mother Nature had failed to provide cross-pollination in the form of insects, and since their giant seed spores were too heavy for the soft, gentle winds of Venus to bear aloft, they had developed perambulatory movement in the young, so that all the planet might know them, and that the young should not choke the old. Early in their life history they had discovered a predilection for animal blood, and to satisfy this unnatural lust, they had brought forth large flesh flowers that the gurgura, the ruswin, the petrus, and the bav could not resist. Wisely, the great Ancardus tree ferns did not kill outright, but took their toll of blood from each passing creature, leaving it to crawl away as best it could, knowing that as soon as it had replenished its life fluid, the silly little beast would come again and again to the bait. Innocent-looking enough were these vampire trees, with their pale, white trunks topped with snowy crowns of crackling fronds, wherein nestled the furled tentacles, curled like rosettes, just above the dead black band which was the eye circle. But those self-same tentacles, sometimes 100 feet long, endowed with the twin senses of hearing and smelling, were as deadly as the cobra, and the eye circle gave vision in every direction. Now, the Ancardus were filled with questions. What is it? Is it animal or vegetable? Whence did it come? How did it get here? Has anyone ever seen such life before? These were but a few of the questions coming from all sides, for during the long millenniums of their evolution, the great Ancardus tree ferns had evolved speech and thought. Not speech such as man uses, nor voice tones like those of the lesser animals. No mechanism could have recorded the speech of the tree ferns, since it possessed no sound as animal life knows sound. But it was there, within the consciousness of the trees themselves. Suddenly, there was an end to the questions. Old Gorn, the patriarch, standing on the edge of the clearing, was voicing his thoughts, and when he spoke, all else were silent. "Children," said he, "a strange visitant has come among us. Never in all my long centuries have I seen the like. None of us knows what this thing may portend for us, but only it can answer our questions. Therefore, let us commune with it. Wait for it to break the silence. Only the foolish ask questions of the infinite." As if his words were the thing the black cylinder awaited, the cylinder spawned, there before their eyes, 2 6-feet-high, free-moving creatures. Never had the great Ancardus tree ferns known such life. Tunnocks and Nushu, 2 newly rooted tree ferns, were too excited to heed the patriarch's warning. Softly they conversed between themselves. "What can they be? Certainly they are quite unlike any trees I ever saw in all my roving days," whispered Tunnocks. Adolescents, unquestionably, murmured Nushu, since they have freedom of movement and walk upright. No animal moves so. Only trees are thus gifted. But how sparse grow their fern crowns! Poor things, there is small beauty in their family, if they are truly representative of their species. Trees indeed. Look again, my friends. An older tree was speaking. Did ever you see trees with bark that grows as theirs grows, away from the bole? And look you to the shortness of the upper tentacles. Ah, they're clawed like the animals. And see, no eye circle either, merely two ugly seeing balls set in pinkish bark. Then they possess but one sucker, and those queer-smelling appendages such as animals use to smell out our flowers. Trees indeed. Soon they'll come seeking our fruits to feast upon. Look you, and see how like they are to that cacmoo that I bled 2 days since, and from which I am still feeling indisposed. On all sides other discussions were carried on. 2 camps were formed, those that liken the spawn of the cylinder to themselves, and those that liken them to the animals. That they walked upright, as no animal walked upright, and wore a fern crown, sparse though it was, made them comparable to the tree ferns. But on the other hand, who had ever heard of trees with seeing balls, single suckers, clawed tentacles, and the like? 2, if they were trees, they had small intelligence. No one expected an animal to have intelligence, for they failed to grasp Gorn's simplest communication. And now they were acting as no other tree, or animal either for that matter, had ever acted. Very rarely there occur on the planet great windstorms, storms strong enough to sway the great Ancardus tree ferns from side to side. Once, a decade back, there had been a storm that had actually bent the boles of the younger, slenderer trees halfway to the ground. Thus, the Ancardus had thought that they knew something of bending. Yet, here were the spawn of the black cylinder doing more than that. They were bending themselves in 2. And no wonder. Some of the young trees had to snicker. To pluck something from the ground, the poor creatures had to bend themselves double, for the simple reason that their grasping tentacles could not reach the ground. To think of it! So engrossed were the trees over this ridiculous predicament of the visitors, they had not bothered to notice what the creatures were picking up from the ground, were gathering together into a heap not far from the open mouth of the cylinder. When they did notice, it was something else to laugh over. The silly things, going to the trouble of collecting those things. Twigs, sticks, desiccated remains of old fronds dropped by the Ancardus. Could one actually believe it? They must be related to the petrus that collect such trash upon which to lie down after tiring themselves by running here and there on their inadequate walking routes. But wait, what was this? Before the very icicles of the trees they did it, bringing the old dead things to life once more. And such life! Several young trees that had pushed close to the edge of the clearing all but lost their balance and toppled over in their surprise, and a great sigh went up from the whole watching forest. Who would have believed that such beautiful flowers dwelt in that old dead cellulose? Not even Gorn was able to name those dancing convolutions. For to the great Ancardus, fire was as unknown as were the men that had brought it into being. What could the Ancardus know of fire in their mist-clothed world, where even lightning was so rare a thing that Gorn, older than the oldest civilization of man, had had no experience with it? Owing and eyeing, the forest stared at the new beauty, enthralled. It was for Elsel, one of the youngest free-moving fern trees, to consider investigating it. Carefully, oh so carefully, so as to draw no attention to himself, he lowered his longest tentacle, unfurling it inch by inch, his eye circlet upon those gorgeous flowers that bloomed and died as rapidly as do the flowers of the zamor bush. And so fully were his senses trained upon those dancing efflorescences that he was not aware of the latest findings of his people concerning the intruders. From downwind, across the clearing, Naxum, an old tree, was reporting. He had the scent, and to the adult trees the brilliance of the saltant flames was paled, All else was as nothing to this new intelligence. Blood and flesh. Blood. Blood. By the forest right, Gorn, the patriarch, should be first to taste the blood. As oldest of the clan, it was his due when strange new delicacies wandered thither. But the ancient tree fern was wise. He had seen what had overtaken tree ferns that had dined unwisely, for not all animal blood is beneficial to tree life. Not far from where he stood, there leaned the remains of a tree fern that had sipped the blood of a pocus, a creature tradition taught was poisonous. It had been at a time of famine, and Daxa, the rash tree, had not listened to Gorn's sage wisdom when that soft-fleshed beast came into the forest. In consequence, Daxa no longer answered when spoken to. Bark had scaled from his sides, leaving ugly raw wounds, and he could no longer stand upright, but leaned against his nearer neighbors that would gladly have allowed him to fall had they been capable of moving their own rooted boles. Therefore, Gorn suggested caution. He asked that lots be drawn, that but one of their number taste the blood of the strangers. That one's reward, in turn, would be that of a hero or a martyr, as the case might be. Wherefrom come this pair, therefrom will come others. Bide your time, and when the black cylinder spawns again, all shall dine. Else leave the creature strictly alone, according to the findings. But for the first time in his patriarchy, his people had not wanted to listen to Gorn. One only to be chosen to the repast? Was Gorn in his dotage? Nay, here was blood, and according to Naxum, its odour was savoury. The pocus, they all knew, was poisonous. Was that reason enough to condemn the new animals likewise? Nay, if Gorn refused his right, then the rest would adhere to the law. The law! And the next instant the forest bloomed like a fairy glade, as every Ancardus within a quarter of a mile of the clearing, excepting Gorn, blossomed with brilliantly tinted false fruits that they brought at will from an excrescence at the tip of the long, grasping tentacles. Henceforth, everything depended upon the prey itself. They would choose that fruit most attractive, and to whomsoever selected went the spoils. That was the law of the forest. Never in the history of the Ancardus had any red-blooded creature refused the lure, and certainly they had no expectation that the newcomers would ignore it. Such a thing was unheard of, yet the men gave but a long, wondering glance at the floral display, turning back to the strange, shiny object they had in the meantime dragged from the cylinder, a queer affair of queerer angles. How were the Ancardus to know this for a radio with which the men intended to contact their home planet, to advise it of their safe arrival? Space, time, radio, these were as nothing to the Ancardus. They knew only consternation at this untoward event. Such a happening was without precedent in their annals. It went against all tradition. An animal to disregard their lush, richly odorous fruit? Unthinkable. Unwilling to believe that the creatures would not rise to the bait sooner or later, they waited, tense. However, not all the Ancardus were thus aroused. Little Elsel, the young free-moving tree fern, was not at all concerned in the blood of the cylinder's spawn. Not until he had rooted himself would he bother himself about fleshy animals. It was the flowering flames of the campfire that intrigued him. By inching his tentacle forward over the ground, he had reached a point midway between the fire and himself without having been detected by either the fire-breeders or the tree ferns. The radio, which the pair were setting up, likewise meant nothing to him. Its squareness was something outside his comprehension. Only in the infinitesimal does nature produce cube shapes, and the object before him was as outre to him as a three-dimensional object would be to a two-dimensional creature. All the senses of the young tree fern were concentrated upon the campfire, with its ebullient blossoms rising and dying in one breath. So it happened that he did not notice that one of the pair had turned its seeing balls in his direction. Rising from the spot upon which he had folded himself, the creature shuffled across the clearing to where Elsel's tentacle tip lay. Frightened, the perambulatory tree fern froze into immobility. His tentacle lay like a dead end of a creeper vine. It gave him shivers to see the beast bend down to inspect it with near-sighted eyeballs, and he sighed a great sigh of relief when the creature went back to the fire. Waiting until he was settled once more, Elsel again took up his march to the flames. It was purely accidental that he brushed the stumpy walking route of the second creature bending over that squarish object by the fire, nor was he prepared for the wild yell the thing emitted, causing the pair of them to dash away in wild confusion. That, however, was to be expected, for did not all animals respect and fear the great Ancardus? Only Elsel had not expected them to return so quickly to pick up his offending tentacle. It made him cringe, that touch of warm, resilient animal flesh. Not until he had taken root could he know excitement at such close proximity. But when the same creature thrust an exploring claw inside one of his rubbery sucking cups that covered the underside of his tentacle, his reaction in closing over the claw was entirely involuntary. If the creature had not screamed in fear and shaken him loose, Elsel would have released him anyway. Still, he was wholly unprepared for the next moment, when the tentacular feeler fell into the fire. To think that those lovely, dancing flowers could be so bitter, so cruel. The agony of Elsel's cry resounded throughout all the forest. The pain was of a proportion the like of which he had never dreamed. No wonder he writhed, beating the air, the ground, in his wild anguish. Again he screamed. Gradually, as the shock died away, he regained sufficient composure to withdraw his wounded appendage. Nursing his pain, he turned away, halting now and then to unfurl the bedeviled member and plunge it deep into the cool, rich loam of the forest floor, wherein there seemed to be a slight balm. One would think that the Ancardus would have taken warning from that direful experience of the young tree fern. They had all seen, and they had heard, yet the smell of the blood that Elsel had drawn was too intoxicating. Simultaneously, a dozen or more long tentacles shot across the clearing to the cylinder into which the men had darted to escape the flaying whip. They avoided the fire, but beyond that the tree ferns were insensible to any danger that might arise from their action. Having learned something of the flexibility of those long, questing arms, the men did not quit the protective shadow of their spaceship immediately, and at sight of those feelers lashing out toward them, they ran again within the confines of the cylinder. Before they could barricade themselves, half the tentacles had followed them in, feeling with sensitive tip ends for the pair, forbidding the shutting of the ship's mouth by their bulk. Instantly, 3 tentacles fastened themselves upon the fighting form of one of the men. Somehow, the other managed to hide himself, and no matter how the remaining feelers searched, they could not find him. Though they possessed scent, they were blind, depending upon the eye circles set just below the fern crown of the tree, and the animal smell of the two was thick inside the cylinder. Even after the captive had been withdrawn inch by inch, battling every step of the way, those others failed to locate his companion, concealed in some crevice. They withdrew at last, only to remain outside, waiting. Jeeb, Massa, and Jaden argued among themselves over their victim, each claiming himself in rightful possession, as they dragged the man across the clearing, lifted him screaming and struggling into the air. Then Massa fastened his suckers upon the pink bark of the creature's arm, and imbibed deeply of the rich life fluid. That was too much for the others. Forgetting their quarrel, they realized that part of the feast is better than none at all. Here was one creature who would not be allowed to crawl away half dead, to return again on the morrow. They would suck him dry and toss the husk away. But it had not entered the thoughts of the Ancardus that the second man would actually come to the rescue of his brother creature. The Ancardus were individualists, banding together only when concerned with the common weal of their species. They could not conceive of unselfishness in another. Therefore, Those that guarded the cylinder mouth had permitted their appendages to grow lax, and they were wholly unprepared to act instantly, as the second man came hurtling into the open, in answer to the pleas of his fellow. Elsel had taught him how the Ancardus reacted to even a minor burn, and he had good reason to be glad that the campfire was ready at hand. Grasping a lighted brand, he flung it among the serpentine coils that held his friend aloft, and again the forest listened to the agony shriek of their kind in answer to the bite of the flame blossoms. Unconsciously, Massa and Jaden flinched, and in so doing loosed their hold upon their victim. Then, as a second and third flaming brand came flying through the air, they dropped the captive. Weakened by loss of blood and dazed by the 12-foot fall, the man was slow in reorganizing his faculties, and before he succeeded in regaining his upright position, 2 more tentacles reached out and grasped him. In their gluttony, the rest of the tree ferns disregarded the menace of the flame flowers. Only no more brands came flying through the air as those tentacles in the clearing sought out the avenger. To each he was forced to give his baptism of fire before they were willing to leave him to his own devices. But they served to reduce his ammunition, and to replenish it the man had to leave the fire, dash here and there, to gather such sticks as lay close at hand. Twice a tentacle all but tripped him, but he danced safely away each time, and with the new supply of torches renewed the succor of his friend. Reluctantly, the constricting coils released the captive, who managed to climb to his walking roots and stagger several steps before another blood-crazed tree fern plucked him up. Shaking a balled-up claw at the trees, the fire breeder went farther afield to collect more fuel, taking a lighted torch for his own protection. Now, all this while old Gorn had thoughtfully been considering the scene. It had come to him that without a replenishment of his campfire, the fire breeder was powerless. Thereupon, he transferred his surmise to his people, pointing out that if they but prevented the creature from gathering more faggots, there could be no more fire blossoms. Acting instantly upon the suggestion, a threatening circle was formed just out of reach of the fire itself. But Gorn had not taken into account that inexplicable force driving the man to the aid of his companion. Finding his way barred on all sides, he refused to acknowledge defeat. Turning upon himself, he tore away part of what to the trees appeared to be his outer bark and threw it into the fire. Appalled, they saw him pluck it out, flame-covered, and toss it into the air. Taking the form of the Fusime, the only flying thing of Venus, the coat slithered toward the captive man. Straightway Hedge and Herald, his captors, dropped him just in time as the burn thing enfolded him, falling flame-side out. That large chunk of burning life was too much for the horrified tree ferns. Had the great Ancardus tree ferns but guessed the deadliness of those licking flame tendrils, they would have suffered the agonies of hell to stamp them out. But all they did was to gaze jealously, waiting for the fire blossoms to fade away, that they might again seize their prey. Those that had not been beset by the fire as yet were dubious, only half believing that the golden-red flowers were as hurtful as the screams of those who had felt their scorching breath made them out to be. Still, because they half believed, they stood back, waiting. Meanwhile, their erstwhile victim was having his own troubles. Fire is at best a treacherous friend, and though he had tossed the burning cloak from him, coals of fire had already eased themselves into his hair, his clothing. Slapping them did not avail, and he dropped to the ground to roll and twist in an effort to put them out, only to aggravate them in a bed of dry brush that lay in his path. True, as long as the fire wreathed him, he was safe from the trees, but at the same time his condition was precarious, too weak as he was to fight the fire properly. Piteously, he called to the other to save him. But the fire breeder was in bad straits himself, threatened on every side by the enemy, unable to gather more fuel. He had already removed his boots, was coaxing them to burn, when suddenly he spied something he had not seen before, an old log lying in the shadow of the spaceship. Using one charred shoe in which a flame teased as a shield, he forced several tentacles to give way until he could grasp the log end. Dragging it to the fire, he thrust one end into the fire, but the log refused to burn. Gorn had forgotten that he had begged his people to let the visitors go unmolested. Now, in high glee, he cried out, "He is defeated, and I, in my right, demand his blood. He is mine." And as he spoke, his tentacles shot across the clearing, only to dart away again in dismay. Even as he had spoken, the old log began to smoke. A feather of flame ran halfway up its length, died, only to be followed by a second tendril that bit deep into the butt. Shouting his joy, the fire breeder waited long enough for the fire to burn merrily. Then, like a flaming sword, he used it to force the enemy to writhe away. One by one, the menacing tentacles slithered to one side, opening up the path that led to the side of the other man-creature, who now lay as if dead, soot-blackened. Beating out the flames that still wreathed him, the fire-breeder picked his comrade up and flung him over one shoulder. Then, pausing long enough to take a better grip upon the torch, he advanced, jabbing savagely at those tentacles not quick enough to give way. Powerless to halt him, the Ancardus groaned in unison as he reached the cylinder and disappeared within with his burden, sealing the opening. But even as they lamented their loss and nursed their wounds, the cylinder gaped again, and the figure of the fire-breeder stood poised before him. Exulting, the tree-fern stared. Then, in one accord, dozens of long arms shot out. This time they would have him. But no, the man was wary enough. Before the opening was resealed for the last time, something came arching through the air to land at the roots of old Gorn. It was the flaming torch. Again, the Ancardus turned to their leader for advice. Should they try their strength upon the cylinder, crush it and pluck the creatures like Bav from their hole? For the first time in their existence, the old patriarch had no advice to give. He was more concerned with the hungry flames at his feet, one of which had already tested the texture of an old gnarled root that had broken through the forest loam. The next instant, the cylinder was taking to the air, filling the forest with an ugly roar. Then it was level with the fern crowns. For a moment, it seemed to hang suspended between land and sky, and to the horror of the Ancardus, its rear end seemed to ignite in a great blast of withering fire. The fire-breeder had his revenge, as the long tongue of flame bit deeply into the heart of the Ancardus grove. With his departure, a new sound came into the forest, a deep, throaty roar interspersed with strange, unnameable creakings and cracklings, wherein were intermingled the cries of the dying race, the loudest of which was the shriek of old Gorn. Once inoculated with the virus of the fire, the whole world seemed ready to burn, as immense flowers reared their angry, licking flames into the tallest perches of the forest, devouring everything in their path. Elsel, the young free-moving tree-fern who had taken his hurt to the river, a good quarter of a mile from the clearing, there to lave his tentacle in the flood, saw the flame-flowers advance, apparently pushing the small band of perambulatory ferns that hurried ahead of them toward the river. All the world burns, the young ferns told Elsel. All are gone. Gorn, Naxum, Tunnux, Nushu, Jeeb, Massa, all the great ones, all the middle-aged, all the newly rooted, all consumed by the ravenous flame-flowers that the intruders had loosed into their paradise. All were gone. All. Standing on the river-bank, they waited, fearful, uncertain. They knew they could launch themselves upon the broad river, float upon its bosom into new lands, or they could cross the river to the salt barrens, into which no self-respecting perambulatory tree-fern ever treads. But their own hesitancy closed the first path, as the fluorescent flames were seen to gather at the river's edge, a few 100 feet below, hissing as their fiery tongues tasted that liquid flood, painting the overhead clouds in their lurid light. Out in space, the fire-breather saw that same pyrotechnical glow, saw in his mind's eye that calorific hell that he, a modern Prometheus, had engendered upon the bosom of Venus. The Man-Trap by Hamilton Craigie. The laboratory of Professor Pordenone was a strange and curious place. Entering it, you were immediately sensible of an odor that was like an emanation, rising head-high in an almost overpowering perfume, sickish sweet. It was like the close smell of a hot house, but magnified, as if a giant had dealt there in his strange garden of distorted smells. For it was a place of giants. Out of the loam that was like a thing of life, there rose gigantic plants that towered to the height of a tall man, and beyond it. In the green gloom of a perpetual twilight they rose up, monstrous, misshapen, like a forest of fantastic shapes, seen in the dim shuttle of a dipsomaniac's dream. And there was this about it. You could hear the silence, if you were there to hear it, for it was like the silence of a vault, a singing silence, a silence as of waiting, heavy, like a weight upon the ears, until you opened the door. Then, as if at the quick whisper of a sudden wind, there would come a rustle, a murmur, a movement in that greenish gloom. But there would be no wind, although the sound followed always upon the opening of the door. Now, with the opening of the door, there was revealed a grinning, hairless head, three-pointed, the eyes chill, with a fixed, unwavering, unwholesome brightness, like a painted flame. A moment it peered and grimaced in the doorway. Then, sidling inward like a crab, Professor Pordenone surveyed his grim garden with a mirthless smile. And now, as he stood there, the forest of viscid green seemed welcoming him. It swayed and rustled. Head high at the height of a tall man, the giant fronds writhed and twisted as in a wind invisible, bending and swaying as in a dance of death. But there was no wind. The air of the place, dead, heavy, lifeless, seemed brooding in a changeless calm, as Professor Pordenone stood smiling and rubbing his palms. In the humid air, the flame from the lighted taper in his hand rose upward in the dimness like a painted sword against that dim green background to right and left. Like a licking, hungry tongue, it forked upward now, as the professor turned, lean head thrust forward, like a pointer at gaze. Now his face seemed touched with a sudden, sly malevolence. His thin, spatulate fingers, reaching, had extended the taper with a little flicking motion against a tall plant at his right. Upon the instant, as if it had been a thing alive, the trifoliate frond had bent as a steel blade bends double. Then, as a bayonet thrusts, soundless and swift, its spike-tipped lance had sprung level with his eyes. Professor Pordenone chuckled, moving as a cat moves for all his bulk. An inch, and the great spur had reached him, thrust in cart. The plant, Hecate triformis, was a hypersensitive, of course. Heat acted upon it as the needle to the pole. But for a moment, fantastic as it might have been, it seemed as if it had been almost humanly endowed with motion, malevolent and swift. The professor, moving forward, the taper still in his hand, halted now before a row. Gigantic, dark green they were, shading almost to black, ugly as a toadstool is ugly, 10 feet in air, rearing their crested hoods like cobras, and, like sleeping cobras, nodding their heavy heads with a slow, swinging motion to right and left. The professor, taper held in his fingers like a baton, seemed like a man who walked now with wariness and care. Still with that secret smile edging his thin lips, he faced forward now, bowing as an orchestra leader bows before the curtain. "My children," he whispered, low, "your time will come. Even now is it at hand. I, Udolpho Pordenone, have promised you, and then we shall see." One peering inward at that curious chamber would see, but he would not have believed. For indeed, as might be seen in any hothouse, there were foxglove, starwort, narcissus, orchis, cranefly, and cypripedium, but hideous, distorted, monstrous beyond all imagining, thrusting aloft with filaments that had grown to cables, stamens that were like rising columns, pistils that were like gigantic swords. The thing that had become a bayonet was fantastic and dangerous enough, but it was before a curious monster that seemed a cuttlefish rooted in black loam that the professor paused and gloated. Beneath its soaring antennae, quivering like the sentient fingers of a giant squid, there was a flat white disk, a dead white, like the belly of a snake. Now, as the professor halted before it, this curious disk quivered, shook, moved of a sudden like a hungry mouth, subsided, as the professor, stepping backward a pace, extended the thin taper's flame, like the flicking of a whip, which in effect it was. "Ah, not yet, my friend," the low voice murmured. "Not yet a while, but patience, and it shall be a fact accomplished." Professor Pordenone was in his way a genius, though a perverted one. That plants could feel, that they could even see, he was aware, just as a schoolboy is casually conscious of the inevitableness of 2 and 2. The East Indian sage who had, by an almost miraculous devising, been able to observe with his super-delicate instruments the death throes of a flower, stood merely at the threshold, where the professor had passed onward through the door. Now, as he went outward from his laboratory, he smiled thinly as if in anticipation, an indwelling, secret smile that lingered as he closed shut the heavy door with its patent spring lock. He stood now in a lofty, dark corridor leading to his bachelor quarters, a study and a bedchamber, where, alone, he slept and ate, poring over his formulae like another Faustus, delving in the dark secrets of life and of death. Passing with his swift, silent step into his study and to an elaborate escritoire in the corner, he snapped on the light, for it had come on to evening, and took up a small vial from the desk. In a large, square tub to the right of this desk there was a plant. It was little more than a seedling, but even to its infinitesimal flat disk, it was a perfect replica of that gargantuan horror in the dim garden just beyond. The professor, holding the vial to the light, shook it gently from right to left, removing its glass stopper, in his eyes a queer, greenish light seeming to be mirrored in the contents of that vial, milk pale. 1 drop, a milligram of that candescent liquid, and, as he was wont to say, he could grow trees from grass blades. That seedling now, well, in the morning he would give it new life. Meanwhile, propping the vial against a corner of the desk, he took from a cellaret at his elbow a goblet of old faience, and with it a decanter. He drank once, and again. The vial, unheeded, tilted sidewise, so that, unseen, perhaps 3 drops of its potent liquid spilled over upon that Lilliputian seedling in its tub. Tomorrow, tomorrow, as he had planned it from the first, he expected a visitor, Gamage, the orchis hunter. Gamage, who had laughed at his assertions, laughed at him, Udolpho Pordenone, the great, cited innumerable precedents for his confounding, snapped his fingers at him, belittled him, scoffed at him times without number. And tomorrow Gamage would pay. But first he would show him the proof. After that his enemy would disappear, and by an agency that was neither beast nor human, an agency terrible in its swift, silent vengeance that would indeed leave no trace. Stopping the vial with fingers that trembled in their eagerness, He rose, stumbling against the seedling in its tub. A large green-bottle fly, its motion swift as summer lightning, its drone loud in the stillness, evaded the slow sweep of his hand, to dip in a bewildering, swift spiral downward across the tub. Upon the instant there came a furious, frantic buzzing, and then silence. The fly was gone, but the windows and doors were closed. It could have had no egress from the room. But if the professor had glanced downward at that tub, he would have seen that flat, white disk had strangely broadened 2 diameters, even as he had sat there at the desk. But he did not look. Those giant monsters in that garden of grim shapes had once been seedlings, some of them, indeed, scarce older than from sun to sun. The professor, snapping out the light, moved slowly, with a slow, noiseless chuckle outward to his bedchamber, while behind him, as he slept, separated from his bedroom by the width of a single door, there grew and continued a slow, stealthy rustle. Life, hideous, malformed, rising like a dim tide ceiling-ward, there in the murmurous dark. Professor Pordenone, awaking at his usual hour, dressed in a queer, fumbling haste, departing presently upon an errand which was to occupy the best part of his day. He had been upon the point of returning to his study, when, upon an impulse, he had wheeled, his hand upon the doorknob, in a curious, sudden indecision, which, if he had been superstitious, he might have called a presentiment, a premonition of something felt but unseen, hidden yet half revealed. The liquor that he had drunk had been potent. That must be it, and his errand could not wait. And so he had turned backward, striding from the house, to return at evening, an evening after rain of windy dark, with the wind like a lost soul wailing among the trees, the road like a ribbon of pale flame between black walls of ebony, along which his tall, dark figure, with its flapping coat-tails, went onward to that rendezvous with death. The house of Professor Pordenone stood alone on a little rising ground, about which was the marshland and the river. Now, as the lean scarecrow, with its veiled glance like a cobra searching in the dust, went forward, there sounded close at hand the brool of the rushing river, like a sound heard in dreams. The cry of a loon sounded from the marshland. The melancholy boom of a bittern answered it. The traveller's shadow, in sable silhouette, cut sharp beneath the soaring splendor of the moon, that was like a leprous silvered finger beneath the low-hung curtain of the dark. A little wind, pattering in the dust like the feet of an invisible army of the dead, followed him forth upon the way. It seemed to voice a whisper, a summons, a command, but the dark figure was oblivious. And then, between the nightfall and the night, he beheld a black shadow in the door. It was Gamage. The Orchis hunter moved forward as the Italian came up. "Ah, Professor," he said. "You're on time, I perceive. I was a little early. I've been waiting 5 minutes, but no matter, we've time and to spare." Professor Pordenone observed his visitor under lowered brows. "Ah, yes," he made answer, with a precise, hissing sibilance. "Quite so, my friend. You have all the time there is." The accent upon the word time was of the faintest. He paused, his face a white, glimmering oval against the background of the night. "What is it your Shakespeare says? Time hath, my lord, a wallet on his back, in which he puts alms for oblivion. Is it not so, my friend?" His dark Italian face, with its high cheekbones, showed in a darkling glimmer beneath the tall, shapeless hat. With his wide, foreign cloak, and the white, slender hands moving against the black, there was about him a sinister air, a something hooded and malign. His glance upon his visitor as if the very soul of the man had arisen, deep down, to peer for a moment out of his cold eyes in a sudden, sardonic flicker of unholy mirth. The Orchis hunter may have been aware of it. Perhaps something of this may have been reflected in his look, his tone. Moving outward from the doorway, he shivered slightly in the humid air, for it was not cold. yet it was as if a bleak wind of the spirit had touched him and passed on. "Ah, someone's walking over my grave," he muttered, turning aside as Professor Pordenone moved forward to unlock the door. The wind, rising, clamoured at eave and shutter as the door fell open with a slatting clatter. It shrieked in the chimney on a rising note as the two men, the professor and the lead, went inward to the house. Here in the bedchamber all was darkness and silence, save for the measured ticking of the hall clock, like the beating of a heart, the squeak and scurry of rats in the wainscot. Else was it a silence upon which these empty sounds beat and were lost as raindrops upon velvet. The professor, his finger upon the wall switch, snapped on the light, pointing forward to the closed door leading to his study. "In there, my friend," he said, "I have a surprise for you. It will take but a moment. Through the study and into my garden. For you must see, you must, feel before you will believe. But, que sera, sera. What will be, my friend. Is it not so?" He ceased, and the long, wild laughter of the winds fled past the dripping eaves. Under the lights his face, with its high-arched, broken nose, showed in a Rembrandtesque shading of highlight and shadow, like a Savonarola debased. Then, with his hand upon the doorknob, he paused. Under the light his face, stripped for a moment of its mask, showed for a fleeting instant, like the face of a satyr, satanic in its ultimate suggestion of sheer feline malevolence. The words purred in the silence like a cat's. "Now, my friend, in a moment now, you will see. Have I not promised you?" He flung wide the door to a black velvet wall of Stygian dark, out of which there came on a sudden a rustling, as of invisible pinions, and with it an odour, strong and almost fetid. It swept out upon them in a dim tide of soundless flood. The professor hesitated, wrinkling his nose with a delicate pinching of the thin nostrils, an odd look of surprise upon his face. But the darkness was like a wolf's throat. The single light but emphasized it. It was smothering, opaque, like the thick darkness of a vault. Then he disappeared into that velvet black, even as Gamage, following, heard his quick footfalls pad-padding in the dimness of the study, just ahead. The Orchis hunter froze suddenly in motion. There was a light switch at the door. His fingers were reaching for it, even as, from that midnight black, there came a sound, inhuman, beast-like, such as nothing he had ever heard, or would hear by God's grace, while he might live. Once, on a stricken field, he had heard that sound, or something near it, the scream of a horse in its last agony. It rose now, even as he fumbled for the light switch, died to a choked gurgle, a long, shuddering sigh. Then he snapped on the switch, and as the light sprang to full flower, at what he saw, or thought he saw, a weakness seized upon him, and a quick horror turning his bones to water. For there, towering to the lofty ceiling, uprose a thing, monstrous, unbelievable, a thing that, with its waving tentacles of viscid green, stood like a giant squid rooted in black loam. And then, beneath the flat white disk that was its mouth, the Orchis hunter saw, and seeing, fled outward, trembling, blind and dumb, to the clear air of heaven. For the thing that he had seen, agonized, contorted, ere it disappeared forever, sucked downward in that insensate maw, had been the face of Professor Pordenone. The fly-trap, magnified 10,000 diameters. The seedling, grown overnight to the monster that it had become. The fleshless Frankenstein had found its victim. The man-trap had made its kill. Suzanne by J. Joseph Renaud. In a spacious hall, lit by tall lamps, sat a young man in evening dress, bound in an armchair. Around him stood a woman and 3 men. The young man's downy moustache seemed extremely dark in his spectral face. His gaze was fixed and mournful. The ends of his white tie hung loosely down. Mud was drying on his disordered hair, on his torn white waistcoat, on his black trousers. "Mr. Wilson, once more we tender you our humble apologies, but we're acting in the service of our country, and we must have the text of this new secret military entente between England and France. A general drew it up, a minister signed it, and an attaché of the embassy, you, copied it. The general and the minister are both beyond our reach, so we're obliged to have recourse to the attaché. Don't look so angrily at poor Millie. She too is serving her country. Yesterday evening in her little house you had hoped to find her, and you found us, and we were daring enough to ask you to divulge a state secret. You said, 'No,' so we were obliged to bring you here in a motor car, bound down to one of the seats, enveloped in a great fur cloak and gagged under a chauffeur's mask. It was impossible for the passers-by to guess that this strangely motionless chauffeur was longing to call out, 'Help!' said one of the men in military tones, although his long grey hair and gold-rimmed spectacles gave him more the appearance of a German university professor than of a soldier. 'These cords are torturing me,' panted the prisoner. His eyes wandered back to the beautiful red-haired woman who, closely wrapped up in a mantle, was passionately listening. 'Loose him,' said the man with the gold-rimmed spectacles. The other 2, who were of Herculean build and evidently only subalterns, obeyed the order. But the prisoner was very weak. The floor seemed to be rocking under his feet. He fell over in a faint. When he regained consciousness, he was again sitting in the armchair. Well, no need of cords now. A low diet, the open air, hunger, fatigue, no one can withstand these. And, if necessary, we have something better than that. But you have only to speak. It is so simple. Give us the outlines of this clause, and you are free. Your involuntary complicity will be a guarantee to us for your silence. And when you return home, you will receive a liberal compensation." The young man answered, "You shall know nothing." Stars were still dancing before his eyes, and the humming in his ears had not ceased, while blood was dropping from his wounded wrists. "Since you are obstinate, my dear fellow, we shall be obliged to make you acquainted with Suzanne, a very charming person. But first, permit me to introduce myself. Dr. Saltzman. These gentlemen are my friends and collaborators. Now come." His tone had suddenly become honeyed, ironical, terrifying. The 2 big assistants supported the dragging steps of the prisoner, but the red-haired woman remained behind. She turned away her eyes as the captive passed her. In a corner was the head of a winding iron staircase, which they descended in the dark. A heavy iron door opened before them, and a puff of warm air, smelling of eucalyptus, blew upon them. Fine gravel crunched under their feet with a hollow sound, as though they were in some enormous empty building. Far away, somewhere in the silence, a fountain was splashing. The strange doctor turned on the electric light, and suddenly an enormous conservatory was revealed around them, so vast that its real size could not be gauged, for the small electric lamps, cleverly hidden among the green branches, shed but a feeble glimmering light, and nothing could be seen but foliage, stretching far into the distance on all sides. Above, colossal leaves clustered gracefully on unseen branches in dome-like groups, while above these others were dimly seen, and yet others. All around, above, everywhere, there was but a fantastic tangle, which it was difficult to believe belonged to the vegetable kingdom. Was there not life in these orchids, which looked full of an impotent rage, and in these green spiders, 3 feet high, crouching as though to spring? A confusion of terrifying creatures seemed to inhabit this warm forest, among the shadows and the glimmering lights. No sound from outside, neither the sea flowing over the pebbles nor yet the moaning of the wind penetrated here, but one could almost hear the intense life of all these exotic plants, so crudely green in the pale electric light. The doctor evidently had lavished both wealth and care on this marvelous garden. Several times he stopped the group to mention, with ironical courtesy, the name of some rare plant to the captive who was panting in the heavy, suffocating air. The end of the conservatory was in darkness, but it was just possible to see that it had recently been altered to form a rotunda similar to the monkey houses in zoological gardens, but with stronger trellis work and with some enormous iron bars to further strengthen it. A terrible apprehension aroused the young diplomat from the torpor into which he had fallen, and he suddenly noticed a sweet, sickly odor, somewhat resembling that of overripe bananas, lilies, or decaying dahlias, mixed with the smell of wild beasts. One would have supposed a menagerie was near. The doctor, turning to him, said in the peculiar pedantic tones he had adopted, "Now, my charming young friend, allow me to introduce you to Suzanne." He turned on an enormous electric light hung from the roof of the rotunda. In the dazzling white glare there arose a sort of gigantic tree. Its leafless boughs were waving slowly, like mighty serpents, or like the tentacles of an octopus. The trunk, which could be seen between the movements of the horrible limbs, resembled green marble. At the base it was as thick as a man's body, and increased in girth till, at a height of 12 or 13 feet from the ground, it branched out into 100 long, hairy boughs, all slowly moving as though alive. At the end of each bough, thick as an athlete's arm, was a sort of flexible funnel, which evidently possessed the power of laying hold of objects and clinging to them, so that there was no escape. The shortest of these boughs were 7 or 8 yards long. These monstrous tentacles were not waving at random, but with conscious design they were reaching out toward the grating. Some stretched far enough to seize and twist wires as thick as a cigarette. Ah, if the grating were not there! We must enlarge this cage. Suzanne is growing too fast, said the doctor with a mirthless grin. No one laughed. Although they must have seen it many times before, this horrible plant clearly terrified the doctor's assistants. Wilson felt as though needles were pricking him all over. Although he was suffocating in this foul atmosphere, his teeth were chattering. The doctor continued, "My charming young friend, I see you are a little surprised, but as you are filled with a thirst for knowledge, I will tell you about Suzanne. You must have heard of the South American plant called Nepenthes, which feeds on insects. When a mosquito rests on one of its twigs, the tip seizes it, and all the other twigs coil around it, and it is absorbed by the plant, which, while its digestion is going on, appears to be dead. I brought one back here from Brazil. Japanese gardeners succeed in dwarfing oaks and pine trees till they are only a yard high. Well, I experimented in a contrary direction with my Nepenthes. I tried to cultivate this little shrub, hardly as big as a rosebush, till it should be as tall as a forest tree. I noticed in Brazil that a Nepenthes near an ant-hill, being thus better fed, acquires extraordinary dimensions. I began by stuffing it with flies, and it soon became more vigorous. Then I offered it bigger and bigger insects, such as wasps, spiders, bees, and on this diet it grew 10 inches in a few months. Then, gradually, tiny pieces of meat took the place of the insects. Suzanne's growth now became extraordinary, and her height and strength were soon trebled. I continued increasing the size of her meals. Soon she needed a steak every day, then 2. One day a sparrow perched on her, and in a few seconds it had disappeared among the greedy, ferocious branches. Thenceforth Suzanne showed a strong predilection for living prey. For a year I fed her on mice, then guinea pigs, then rabbits. Besides this, her roots were watered with several pails of blood a day, which I ordered from the slaughter-house. Under this treatment, Suzanne soon reached a height of 7 feet. Well, to cut the story short, she grew higher and higher, and in the end had to be fed on lambs, then sheep and pigs, not to mention the red water, which was doubled. This protecting grating has surrounded Suzanne for a long time now, for when she was scarcely 5 feet high, she seized me one evening, and I had great difficulty in escaping from her embrace. If I had met with this adventure a few months later, I should not have the pleasure of being here at this moment. You guess to what use Suzanne is put. If anyone refuses to give us information which our duty forces us to seek, this is the present case, we bring him back to this house, tied to the seat of a motor. We then question him again, and if he remains obdurate, we thrust him behind this grating. Then we leave him. Of course, no traces remain, and the most minute search would reveal nothing. Am I not at liberty to cultivate a nepenthes if I choose? Well, for the last time I ask, will you tell us what we want to know? If your answer is yes, we are all attention. If no, Suzanne will take you in hand, and she is hungry. See how greedily her boughs are waving, how she stretches them out toward you, yes, toward you, for she understands perfectly well that you are the prey. Why, she already smells stronger, and she is beginning to sing. In very truth, the fearful stench of a menagerie was growing more powerful, and the hairy tentacles, as they twisted and turned, produced a gentle, whining sound, like that of a flight of swallows. Wilson was filled with that unspeakable terror which whitens the hair of the bravest. But the very imminence of the danger kept his mind clear. What could he do? First he must gain time. Otherwise, this very minute would be the last of his life. In the tone of someone who at last comes to a painful decision, he said, I have no choice left. My answer is yes. You will know the treaty. But first give me food. I am fainting. Bravo! I am delighted. I should have been sorry to... We will give you a meal which will loosen your tongue, and Suzanne shall not be the loser, the sweet creature. One of the two giants disappeared, and soon returned, staggering under the dead body of a whole ox, whose horned head was swinging to and fro. He opened a very low side door, and pushed his burden in. 10 tentacles immediately snatched up the enormous bloody mass and threw it into the top of the trunk. All the boughs clasped it frantically, and it soon disappeared amid the confusion of foliage. A dreadful noise was heard, and then all was silent. The branches remained folded, giving the plant the appearance of an enormous mushroom. She would have liked you better. She prefers living creatures, said the doctor. Now she will remain 2 hours, folded up like that, and quite harmless, while the process of digestion is going on. Then the branches will fall and begin to wave again, and it would be very imprudent then to come within their reach. Come, you will excuse me if I take you to my laboratory instead of a dining room. This is the abode of a horticulturist. The laboratory was a large room, with walls painted grey, full of implements for the study of chemistry, electricity, bacteriology, etc. Some were of ancient shape, and Wilson remembered having seen similar ones in scientific museums labelled alchemy. The doctor placed bread, ham, cheese, and a bottle of wine before the young diplomat. Wilson ate voraciously. The very smell of the bread intoxicated him. The ham melted in his mouth like a delicious sweet. He drank, and the taste of old Bordeaux tickled his palate. Soon a pleasant feeling of warmth and comfort overcame him. Life began to flow through his veins. The food had made a new man of him. He began to feel optimistic, in spite of everything. He no longer despaired of escape. If only... But he searched in vain among the instruments for a knife, a pair of compasses, anything which could serve as a weapon. There was nothing but test tubes, bottles, funnels. The others were carrying on a whispered conversation in a corner, without paying much attention to him. The only thing that attracted his attention was a phial with a label bearing the word chloroform. He slipped it into his pocket. His death should be painless. As Wilson swallowed his last mouthful, Dr. Saltzman said, "We are listening." There was a little wine left in the bottle. The prisoner poured it out, drank it, and smacked his lips. "You have a good cellar, sir." "Yes." "Well?" "Well, you scoundrels, did you really suppose I ever intended to divulge anything? I was hungry, nothing more." The doctor's face puckered into 100 wrinkles. "That is all you have to say? Think what that great cage contains." "It contains my death, that is all. My answer remains the same." A few moments later, bound again, Wilson was carried by the two giants to the rotunda. The horrible tree was still dozing, with its tentacles folded, but the awakening would come soon. A large door was unbolted. They placed the captive against the trunk, which was warm like a living body. The door was double-locked and bolted. "I regret your obstinacy. You are a brave man," said the doctor, whose exultation seemed to have subsided like that of the tree. He bowed and departed. The assistants gave a stiff military salute, then made a right-about turn. Left alone, the prisoner first turned his attention to escaping from the horrible contact of the warm trunk. He succeeded gradually by rolling over on his side, and he did not stop till he had reached the corner of the cage farthest from the plant. Either from forgetfulness or from cruelty, the doctor had omitted to turn off the light. It flooded the immense conservatory and the rotunda. In the distance, somewhere behind all the tropical plants, the fountain continued its never-ceasing splash, splash. He was lost. No hope was left. The dreadful creature would soon awaken, and then... He thought of the chloroform. At the last moment he would inhale it and deaden all sensibility. With his free hand he took the phial out of his pocket and left it uncorked for a few moments. A smell of fresh apple prevailed over the stench of the monster. But he clung tenaciously to life, and his youth inspired him with confidence in the result of any fight maintained to the end. He did not give in. Horrible as his position undoubtedly was, he wanted to show fight. They had bound him not very tightly after all, and in a few minutes, at the cost of a few scratches, he was free. Quick to act, and concentrating all his strength in a mighty effort, he tried first the little door, then the big one, but both resisted. He tried to smash the grating, but not a wire gave way. He tried to climb, and only wounded his hands to no effect. Even had he succeeded, it would have been useless, for the tentacles would reach to the very top of the rotunda. He could do nothing more, only wait. He sat down with his elbows on his knees, and his face buried in his hands. All the happy moments of his life rose before him with extraordinary distinctness. His first years at school, his travels, his successes in diplomacy. The sweet, sad face of his mother smiled at him, as clearly as when she used to sing him to sleep in his cot. And his father, what grief it would be to the poor old man who was so proud of him. What joys he might have tasted, what great things he might have accomplished, if he could only write to Milly, the traitress whom he still loved. If he could but throw through the grating a note which they would find afterwards. He felt in his pockets. Yes, a pencil and paper. With difficulty he wrote in great round letters, "Milly, I die with no hatred in my heart. I love you, and my last thought shall be of you, my ever-beloved, my beautiful." A hissing sound caused him to look up. The plant was no longer asleep. It looked like an enormous gorgon's head or nest of furious serpents. The tentacles were waving with strength. One seized upon Wilson, who, mad with terror, uncorked the bottle of chloroform and held it to his nostrils. In his haste, he let fall a drop of the liquid on the tentacle, which had just clutched him by the shoulder, when, to his joy and surprise, the strange arm fell limply down beside the trunk. Instinctively, he sprinkled another enormous coil which was about to wind itself around his neck. This one, too, fell like the first, apparently dead. But the others were whirling around him. They seized him in their embrace, and, as they waved backward in their fury, they carried him to the top of the pulp, above the sort of mouth in which the ox had disappeared. Half fainting, bruised by the awful embrace, he dropped there the phial. At the same moment, he fell heavily to the ground. Here he remained motionless and dazed. What would happen next? Why were the monster's tentacles not crushing him? It took him a few seconds to make sure that he was on the ground, bruised but alive. He struggled against a painful numbness, caused by the violence of his fall and the odor of the chloroform. He felt sick and faint, and a cold perspiration was pouring from him. When, at last, he was able to see clearly, he discovered that the horrible tree was in a new posture. All its branches were hanging down, motionless, as though dead. The doctor's frightful plant had the appearance of a gigantic weeping willow. He was only a few inches from the arms, which but a moment before had been so ferocious, and although they appeared harmless now, he rose hastily and took refuge in the farthest corner of the rotunda. Here, the stupefying influence of the chloroform and of the fall passed away altogether, and he tried to understand what had happened. This was not difficult. The providential bottle of benumbing fluid had saved him, at least for the moment, from a frightful death. All plants are sensitive to the effects of chloroform, and this carnivorous tree, which in some ways seemed to belong rather to the animal than the vegetable kingdom, must have peculiarly felt the benumbing influence. At this moment it was just as insensible as a patient under a surgical operation, but this was only a respite. It would awaken from this insensibility as it awoke after its meal, and the peril would be just as frightful as before. But any respite from death is precious. The prisoner made another attempt to open the doors and climb up the grating, the upper parts of which perhaps were less strongly built. But again the wires only wounded his hands, and again the doors resisted all his efforts. Although the monster was slumbering, escape was as impossible as ever. Wilson at last sat down again, weary and despairing. He half regretted that it was not all over, for the chloroform had only prolonged his agony. If die he must, he would rather die at once. Time passed thus, till at last he became aware of a pale blue light which revealed first a glass dome, and then the tops of the highest of the tropical plants. At last, then, dawn had come. But this half-light was sickening, horrible. Far away, but perhaps he only imagined this, the Angelus slowly rang forth. The mighty murmur of the waves as they rose and fell increased. Near at hand, birds were chirping. Worn out, bruised and bleeding, almost careless of his fate, Wilson gradually yielded to sleep. The sounds of steps aroused him from his torpor, and brought him to his feet. As he gazed through the grating, he distinguished in the distance the silhouette of Dr. Saltzman coming toward the rotunda. The terrible man would find out that his victim was still alive. He would call his acolytes. The captive hid behind the horrible tree, among the tentacles. Like a child playing at hide-and-seek, he turned, in spite of his disgust, around the warm trunk, dodging the doctor, as the winding paths led the latter's steps first to the right and then to the left. When the doctor saw the extraordinary attitude of Suzanne, he uttered an exclamation of surprise. For a moment he stood motionless. Then, to Wilson's unspeakable joy, he opened the great door of the cage and cautiously entered. With the end of his stick he touched the tentacles, being careful all the time to slouch as far away as possible, but the horrible arm still hung lifeless as before. He ventured a little nearer, and thought he saw a phantom. Wilson had sprung away from the plant. The doctor uttered a cry of terror, and at the same moment there fell on his jaw a crushing blow. He fell limply to the ground. Wilson rushed out of the cage and ran along the first path he came to, but the conservatory was a perfect labyrinth, and he soon found himself back again at the rotunda. In vain he tried another path, and yet another. At last one led him to the side of the conservatory, overlooking the sea. He brushed away the steam with his hand, and, looking through the glass, he saw in the rosy dawn a pale stretch of sands, and farther on the green, tumultuous waves of the sea. There were several large doors leading out of the conservatory. He opened and stepped out, but the icy air and the roar of the waves benumbed him. He found himself on a tiny balcony which ran along the side of the building, while below him was the smooth wall of the great house. Below lay a fog, hiding the bottom of the abyss, while above seabirds were whirling round, uttering their harsh cries. How was he to descend? Was there some means of escape? He left the balcony, but had walked only a few moments in the soporific heat of the conservatory, when the sound of steps, cries, shouts for help, following each other in quick succession, caused him to turn back. He still had a few moments in which to make good his escape, for the assistants would not immediately grasp what had happened, and decide on their course of action. But when they saw the open door, the condition of their chief, and the torpor of the plant, they would understand all too soon that their prisoner was escaping. Again he dashed on to the balcony in search of some means by which he could descend. At one end was an iron bar, which, strengthened every 3 feet by strong cramps, rose up from the sands, followed the contour of the cliff, and then rose straight up to the top of the conservatory, where it doubtless joined a lightning conductor. This bar passed up one end of the balcony, and Wilson believed himself saved. It was a perilous descent, but he had no choice. He climbed over the handrail and grasped the bar, but horrible giddiness seized him. The wall, the cliff, the bar, the balcony, all danced before his distracted eyes. He had a terrible feeling of nausea, and was drenched in a cold sweat. Only a supreme effort saved him from falling. Hastily climbing back onto the balcony, panting with horror, he wiped his cold, clammy hands. Was his courage going to fail him at the last moment? He tried to accustom his eyes to the sight of the abyss, but the horrible depths and the mist hiding the ground from view sent him back into the conservatory. He lay down flat behind a clump of trees. The 2 giants, armed with guns, passed quite close to him without seeing him. As soon as they had gone, he arose and ran along in the opposite direction toward the door at the foot of the iron staircase. Surely he was saved now, for he felt certain that no one else lived in the house. He could get out. He started back. In the frame of the door he dimly saw a great green cloak, a head of glorious red hair, a pale face, a beautiful bare arm, and a hand grasping a revolver. Millie! She stood between him and life. With the suddenness and precision which had one day astonished him at her rifle range, and the cruelty which he now remembered he had sometimes seen flash from the beautiful green eyes, she was going to— Ah, no! She stepped forth from the shadow, like a Rembrandt from its frame. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, and despair was written on her features. In her other hand she held aloft the farewell letter which Wilson had written on the rotunda. "I have read it. Forgive me, and come quickly," she said in low tones. He followed her. The narrow stairs hindered their steps. When they reached the top, they passed through several large rooms, a hall and a kitchen dimly lit up by the grey dawn. Then Millie stopped and turned round. He noticed all these details as though in a dream. She softly opened the door. The morning was icy cold. Birds were twittering all round. Go through the kitchen garden. You will find a little door in the wall. The gardener always leaves the key in it. The path descends almost perpendicularly, then runs along beside the sea. When you come to a cross fixed into a block of granite, stop and wait." He was in the state of utter fatigue in which the will, incapable of making a choice, eagerly follows without reflection any advice. However, he stopped long enough to say, "Come with me." Her swift gesture threw aside the mantle and revealed her exquisite ball gown and her beautiful white neck as she pointed to the door in the wall. "Quick!" she urged. He hurried along. Before closing the door of the garden, he turned and saw Milly still on the same spot. Her attitude urged him to hasten, but at the same time expressed such poignant grief that he was tempted to return. Slipping on the pebbles, clinging to the bushes, he descended the difficult path. An iron band seemed to encircle his head. The sea air made his eyes smart. He began to cough. When he was close to the sea, he took up a handful of water and dashed it over his face and head. He walked a long, long way along the edge of the roaring channel, till at last, in the distance, his uncertain gaze fell on a rusty iron cross on a great rock. The horrible house, far away in the distance, was tiny and white on the bluish cliff. Suddenly it disappeared in a mass of black smoke, while at the same time a loud report echoed and re-echoed among the rocks. All the birds around flew up into the sky. At noon, some coast guards found Wilson raving in delirium. When he at last arose from an attack of brain fever, he told his story, but no one believed it. The police made inquiries without result, yet he was able to guide the officers to the ruins of the conservatory and show an immense greasy spot, which, he declared, was where the Nepenthes had stood. The Hedge by Alfred I. Tuke. People came from miles around to see the wonderful hedge that encircled the great estate of Count Martel. In bloom, the hedge was a sight of almost unbelievable beauty, mile upon mile of gorgeous flaming blossoms, and somewhere along those miles you would come upon a solitary man, industriously snipping, trimming the hedge with a precision and dexterity that bespoke years of practice. The Count himself noticed the man one day, as he drove along engrossed in a business problem. He could not be sure of the date, nor could his magnificently liveried chauffeur, so the car was stopped. "Hi there. What date is it?" the Count called. The steady snip ceased. The man glanced deliberately about him, at a rock, a tree, a mound across the road, as though seeking the answer in them. Then he nodded. "The 25th of June, sir." "Are you positive?" "Quite sure, sir. I'm always at this point on the 25th of June, sir." "Always?" "Always, sir." "How long have you been doing this task?" "Ever since I was able to do anything, sir." "How old are you?" 35, sir." "And how long does it take you to trim the entire hedge?" "Exactly 1 year, to go twice around, sir." The Count's brows knitted ponderously. "You mean to say you spend your life going round and round this hedge, snipping and trimming, never catching up, never falling behind, never finishing your task?" "Yes, sir." "What is your name?" "Manuel Toro, sir." "And you can tell what day of the year it is by the hedge?" The Count frowned. "Well, I must not delay you, Manuel, or I may be delaying the passage of time itself." The Count seemed strangely preoccupied during the rest of the day. Those with whom he transacted business remarked that he was getting absent-minded. He did not appear to hear some of the questions they asked, and his replies to others were vague or irrelevant, as though some profound problem monopolized his attention. That night, he awoke and rang for sedatives. "I had a horrible nightmare, Marco," he said. "I dreamed I was clipping a hedge, and could not clip fast enough. It grew and grew about me, smothering me." "It was the lobster salad, perhaps, sir." "Perhaps." But the following night, it could not have been lobster salad, for none was served. The Count tossed restlessly all night, and, rising early, called for the wage roll. Having consulted it, he was driven along the road encircling his estate until he observed the lone figure snip-snipping at the hedge. "Manuel Toro," he called. "Come here. I am Count Martel. I own this hedge. Who hired you to clip it?" "Well, sir, it is Count Martel who always pays my wages." "There must be some mistake. I have consulted the records for many years back, and it is 60 years since my grandfather hired a Manuel Toro to clip this hedge. You are only 35. "That was my grandfather he hired, sir," Manuel replied, unabashed. "Then who hired you?" "Well, sir, when my grandfather grew old and slow, my father helped him, doing more each day as my grandfather did less, until, when my grandfather died, my father was doing it all, and since his name was Manuel Toro, the wages were paid to him. And when your father grew old and slow, I helped, sir, doing more as he did less, until when he died." "Yes, yes. And when you grow old and slow?" "I have a son named Manuel, sir, who will help me." The Count motioned the car on, and stared into vacancy, as though visioning vistas of years down which innumerable Manuel Toros snip their way along that hedge, never catching up, never falling behind, but maintaining a pace inevitable as the passage of time itself. Much of the grief and unhappiness in this world is caused by our failure to appreciate the viewpoint of others. Manuel Toro loved his work. To tend and care for the hedge, so that it would blazon forth each year into exquisite beauty that people would come from far and near to see, was not a task so much as an honor, and he was filled with pride when people said, "See, there goes Manuel Toro, the hedge clipper." But to Count Martel, the thought of that interminable snip-snipping was intolerable. It irritated his mind as a sharp flint in his shoe would have irritated his foot. He saw in it only unending monotony. That night, he groaned and called out in his sleep until Marco awakened him not once, but a dozen times, and always it was the same dream, a hedge that grew and grew, encompassing the Count and his battalions of Manuel Toros, in spite of their frantic snipping, until it smothered them. Long before dawn, the Count was up and busy. "It must be put a stop to, Alexa," he commanded his head gardener. "Have the hedge cut down completely. Have a stone wall built in its place." Alexa stared with horrified eyes and raised protesting hands. Cut down the hedge? The glorious hedge that all the world made pilgrimage to see? That was sacrilege second only to the sacking of churches and the ravishing of holy things. "Bring me an axe, Alexa." With his own hands, Count Martel raised the first yard of hedge. With his own hands, he laid the first stone in the wall that was to take its place. Daily, he urged the work forward, until, after many months, not a branch or leaf of the hedge remained. In its place was a grim stone wall that would stand without care, without attention, throughout the ages. For the first time in months, the Count slept well. In the morning, he ordered a car, and was driven in triumphant satisfaction around the wall that now encompassed his estate. But suddenly, a startled command brought the car to a stop, as he found himself staring at a familiar figure stooped beside the wall, snipping away as though life depended upon it. "What does this mean, Patel?" he asked his chauffeur. "I told them to give this man other work. Why does he snip at a stone wall as though it were a hedge?" "Didn't they tell you, sir?" "Tell me? Tell me what?" "Why, this hedge, sir. When he found them cutting it down, he went stark, staring crazy. They shut him up until he was quiet, and now he is loose. Drive me home, Patel. Don't sit there raving like a lunatic. Drive me home. If you ever pass the estate of Count Martel, you may see Manuel Toro, now grown old and stooped, but still snip-snipping, working his endless way around the great wall. And if you ask concerning Count Martel, they may point to a window in the east tower, and tell you that in that room a man goes round and round, year in and year out, snip-snipping away with stiff fingers at the flowers and leaves upon the wallpaper. It is Count Martel. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,